So today I'm actually presenting on a paper that just came out actually in the Journal of European Public Policy, which I wrote with Maurits Meijers, who's technically the first author on it, but that's only because of alphabetical reasons. And so his name goes in parentheses. And it's entitled When Shifting Backfires, the Electoral Consequences of Responding to Niche Party EU Positions. So as I said, this actually came out 10 days ago, I think it was, in the Journal of European Public Policy. And I encourage you to read it because I like it. But it is publicly available. If you don't have access to JEP, just send me an email. I'm more than happy to share the article as well. So the research question of this study is actually really straightforward. What we wanted to know is what is the electoral effect of mainstream parties moving towards the positions of niche political parties, right? So let's say when, these traditional old school political parties in European countries start to accommodate, take on the positions of niche political parties, these smaller challenger political parties, what are the electoral effects of that? So specifically, do the mainstream parties get rewarded or do they get punished? Do they win more votes or do they lose votes? Right? And as my co-author and I were thinking about this, we started focusing on this aspect of this, what the effect of previous niche party success is on this relationship, right? So when we're talking about mainstream parties shifting towards niche parties, not all niche parties are the same, right? Some of these niche parties are more established, some of them are more successful. So we kind of want to know, does that change the way this works? So I guess we should probably start quickly talking about political parties and these spatial shifts that we expect, right? So we know political parties respond to things like public opinion for sure, right? And research has also shown that they respond to the other parties in their system. They change their positions relative to other parties to try and gain electoral advantage. And there's research in the last few years, but going back probably about a decade, that show that these mainstream parties are extremely responsive to these niche political parties. And what are niche political parties? The definition is a bit murky, depends on what research you're looking at, but essentially it's kind of these insurgent challenger parties that focus on non-politicized issues, and they try to politicize those issues. So mainstream parties tend to kind of move towards these parties, and I think the prime example of a niche party would be, say, like a Green Party, right? It politicizes this environmental issue, came out of nowhere, cross-cuts the existing left-right cleavage, etc., right? So we know these mainstream parties respond to this. And so these niche parties, they act as what we call issue entrepreneurs, right? They find issues that no one is really talking about. They then take these issues and they try to politicize them, try to make them important, make them salient to the public, in order to try and kind of gain some votes and gain some power, right? And importantly, these new issues that they find, as I said, cross-cut these existing cleavages. So there might be some on the right and some on the left who find the issues attractive. Okay? So this politicization of these issues by these niche parties constitutes an electoral threat to the mainstream parties, right? They threaten these parties, threaten taking away votes, essentially, kind of siphoning votes off here and on the margins, right? So the mainstream parties, wanting to react to this electoral threat, tend to shift towards these niche parties, towards the positions of these niche parties, to try and bring the voters back in. It's a pretty straightforward and logical response, right? I think we can all understand that. So, what are the effects of these shifts, though? Right? The idea is to bring the voters back in, and there's reason to believe that these shifts do benefit the mainstream parties. So, Bonnie McGee, in her seminal work, argued and actually found evidence that moving towards niche party positions, it challenges what we call the exclusive issue ownership of these niche parties. So the niche parties own the environmental issue, for example, or they own the issue of immigration, or the issue of European integration. All right? And so the mainstream party moving towards that niche party challenges that. The public no longer sees the niche party as being the exclusive owner of this. And what I mean by exclusive owner is that there's almost instantaneous association in the minds of voters between that niche party, that challenger party, and the issue you're talking about. So if you say environmental issues, people immediately think Green Party, right? That is issue ownership. So a mainstream party moving towards this position challenges that. It tries to change the public's view of this. So the public doesn't necessarily see these niche parties as exclusively owning these issues. And by doing that, the mainstream party is drawing voters away from the niche parties towards the mainstream parties. Again, straight, simple logic here. But we think that there's actually a caveat to this, and it's what we call the niche party success caveat. McGee also wrote, a mainstream party's ability to acquire issue ownership is severely limited once the niche party's reputation as the rightful issue owner is entrenched. Right? So what that means is essentially, once these niche parties establish themselves, once the public accepts them and sees them as the rightful owner, it's very hard for the mainstream party to kind of challenge that issue ownership. Right? If they can't challenge that issue ownership, they can't usurp the position, and if they can't usurp the position, well then there isn't much expected positive gain by shifting towards these parties, right? You're not challenging the issue ownership, that niche party is still going to own that issue, so you're not bringing people back in. So with this caveat, with niche party success, we expect that mainstream parties probably don't gain too much vote, right, by shifting towards more successful niche parties. But it gets worse for mainstream parties even, right? And that's because of issue salience. Right? Mainstream party accommodative strategy, that is shifting towards the niche parties, actually increases the salience of the niche party issue. Right now, the mainstream party is talking about it. They're legitimizing this position. They're legitimizing this issue. They're talking about, say, immigration or environmental issues or European integration. Right? And it's making it more important to the public. Right? So if the salience is increasing and the public sees the niche party as the rightful issue owner here, it could actually help the niche party, right? So by increasing the number of voters who care about this, the mainstream parties may actually be pushing voters away from the mainstream parties and towards the niche parties. If we want to think about this in terms of concrete examples, we can think about the issue of European integration. This is your quintessential niche issue. Before 1993, this was not a politicized issue, right? It was what we called a permissive consensus. The public accepted this, said, okay, elites can push forward integration, we don't really care that much. We don't pay attention, we don't vote on this, we don't care. After 1993 and the creation of the Maastricht Treaty, what we did see was this kind of increasing politicization and this constraining dissensus. The public started to become divided on this and politicized. And it's not coincidental that at the same time we saw niche parties arising around this issue. We saw niche parties, your most quintessential of them, the United Kingdom Independence Party, actually was founded in 1993, right after the Maastricht Treaty. This is the most quintessential Eurosceptic political party in Europe, right? And what these niche parties did was they took this issue and they politicized it. They made it politically important to the public in the EU. Right? Now, also, it's important to remember a niche issue cross-cuts existing cleavages. Right? And this issue of European integration actually does cross-cut this as well. Right? You do have Eurosceptics on the right and you have Eurosceptics on the left. So European integration is this perfect example of a niche issue. And this is what I want to kind of talk about a little bit more here, this specific example. So theoretically, when I'm talking about shifting towards a mainstream niche party position, I'm thinking about European integration here, okay? And what niche parties? Because the mainstream parties need to be shifting towards niche parties, right? That's the key here. They have to be taking the positions of the niche parties. So we're talking about the position of Euroscepticism. The niche parties, well, as I said, this issue of European integration cross-cuts this left-right cleavage. On the radical right, we have hard Eurosceptics. That is to say, people who oppose the EU no matter what. They do not want integration, they want out of the EU. this is their go-to, right? They don't like it at all, and they want out no matter what, right? And this is oftentimes based in nativism, nationalism, cultural Euroscepticism, concerns that the culture of their country is being degraded, identity threat, right? On the radical left, it's a little different. This is a soft Euroscepticism. And the radical left concerns about the EU are rooted in economic reasons, right? Seeing the EU as a neoliberal experiment, quote unquote, right? A set of institutions, a governmental system designed to degrade the welfare state, to lead to greater globalization and market deregulation, etc. So the radical left actually is a little different. They want to reform the European Union, make it a little more leftist, let's say, and short of being able to reform the EU, they say their country should leave. So which of these parties are we thinking about here? Radical right or radical left? Well, we're talking about mainstream parties shifting in the face of greater Euroscepticism, shifting towards the position of Euroscepticism. And the research suggests that these radical left Eurosceptic parties, they don't really have much effect on mainstream party positions. Mainstream parties tend not to respond to radical left Euroscepticism, and even when they do, it tends to be indirect. That is to say, radical left parties talk about, say, degradation of the welfare state, and mainstream parties actually grow a little bit more Eurosceptic in response to that, not wanting to directly address the radical left position for fear of increasing salience. Right? So what we're talking about here is radical right parties. So I guess the way to think about this, I laid out this theory of kind of this increasing salience, right, that drives people away from the mainstream party towards the niche party. What we're talking about here is mainstream parties shifting towards greater Euroscepticism in the face of more successful radical right parties. Okay? So we actually have our first hypothesis here, which says that these mainstream party shifts towards greater Euroscepticism result in a lower vote share for the mainstream party when the radical right party in a country has been more successful. Let's say mainstream party moves towards Euroscepticism. If the radical right party has been successful, the mainstream party will lose votes. Okay? We also have differentiated effects expectation, though. Right? Niche party issues have greater or lesser appeal to the pools from different mainstream parties. As I said before, this radical right Euroscepticism is rooted in this nativist rejection of the EU, this nationalism, this cultural Euroscepticism. Positional shift on integration in the face of a radical right party is going to increase the salience of this cultural Euroscepticism. So if you remember, increasing salience was the causal mechanism here. Right? So we're seeing this increase in cultural Euroscepticism. Well, this means that voters concerned with the issue of European integration for these cultural reasons are the ones who are likely to abandon a shifting mainstream party for a radical right party. Right? And it just so happens that cultural Euroscepticism is more likely for voters on the center right than the center left. Right? So that is to say, if we want to think about concrete examples, the Christian Democratic Union in Germany, or Les Républicains in France, these voters, these kind of center-right voters are going to be much more concerned about cultural aspects of the EU than, say, a voter for the Social Democratic Party of Germany, right? Or I guess the Socialist Party of France barely exists anymore. But those kind of center-left voters are going to be less concerned about those cultural aspects. So this leads to a second hypothesis. And this hypothesis is that center-right mainstream parties are going to lose more vote share when shifting towards Euroscepticism in the face of a more successful radical right party than will center-left mainstream parties. So same type of shift, radical left, radical right, center left, center right. The center right parties are going to lose to a greater degree than the center left. So then, how do we go about testing this? The dependent variable is actually pretty straightforward here. We look at the vote share of mainstream parties in 14 EU member countries. These are Austria, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, France, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Latvia, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the UK. So we have a nice mixture here of some original member states, some newer member states, some Eastern European states, some Western European states. The reason we focus on these 14 countries is because for the measurement of our independent variable, we need to have 2 elections in a row in which the same radical right party competed. And these are the 14 countries in which we have that data. Okay? So our data for vote share covers elections from 1979 through 2015. We actually did have the data going back to 1963, but it was almost entirely Italy and then France coming in the early 70s. So we didn't really feel comfortable overrepresenting Italy all that much, since it is a bit of an outlier in a lot of ways. So we defined mainstream parties as any party belonging to the conservative, Christian Democratic, liberal, or social democratic families. These are your old school traditional party families, right? The data we use here for vote share and also for defining the mainstream parties comes from the Comparative Manifestos Project data, which, if you're unaware, is an incredibly good source of data on parties. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Our independent variable is an interaction term between mainstream party movement towards Euroscepticism and the electoral success of radical right niche party. So movement towards Euroscepticism is measured as the change in the log of the differences of the percentages of Eurosceptic and Europhilic quasi-sentences in a party's manifesto between the election at time t0 and the election at time t-1. I think that's pretty straightforward, right? So this is where I'll talk a little bit about the Manifestos Project. So what the Manifestos Project has done is it's taken the manifestos, in American parlance it would be like platforms, of the political parties that compete in all of these countries, right, in the national level elections. And they break it up into quasi-sentences. A quasi-sentence is simply just a thought, right? It's an independent thought. So it doesn't have to be a full sentence. You can have an independent, more than one independent thought in a sentence. So a quasi-sentence is an independent thought or idea. And what they do is they code them as to what issue they're talking about, and then positive or negative. So they code all these quasi-sentences regarding, say, a statement in a manifesto. Was it about European integration? Yes. Was it positive towards integration or negative towards integration? And then they'll report the number of actual quasi-sentences, but also as a percentage of the manifesto. Right? So how many statements in a manifesto are positive towards the EU and negative towards the EU? To get the position on European integration, you take the difference in these. And we take the log for mathematical reasons that I don't think are necessary in this forum to talk about. So it's really just the change in whether or not a party says more positive things about the EU or negative things about the EU between two elections. Cool. Is that good? Everyone clear on that? Okay, cool. Our measurement for radical right party and niche party success is radical right party vote share in the previous election, right? So it's lagged by one election. Okay, that's pretty simple to understand. I don't have to go into a discussion about that. Radical right parties we define as anything that is considered to be a nationalist party in the comparative manifestos data. And we have also included UKIP in this. UKIP is actually classified as a conservative party. I think that's a misclassification, and I think you do too. It is clearly a nationalist party. So that one we actually code as a radical right party as well. Control variables, we have a bunch of them. I don't think we need to go into each one of these, but most importantly is this one, public Euroscepticism. So we control for whether or not the public is opposed to the EU or not, what percentage of the public is opposed to the EU or not. And also we control for the lagged radical left Euroscepticism. So is there a radical left party in the country in the previous election, and how Eurosceptic are they? If anyone has questions about these controls, I'm more than happy to talk about them later. Okay, so modeling. Our dependent variable is continuous, right? So that means, or at least it approximates continuity, right? It's pretty close to continuous. It's vote share, so 0 to 100. That means OLS regression is most appropriate, right? Our data, however, is time series cross-sectional. So that means we have concerns about autocorrelation, right? So we included a lagged version of the dependent variable on the right-hand side of the equation. We also include year fixed effects, and we cluster our standard errors by country. I want to talk for a second about hypothesis 2. This is the one where we said there are going to be differentiated effects. Center-right and center-left parties are going to react differently, or are going to be affected differently, I should say. In order to test this, we actually use two models. Right? We split the sample by center-right parties and center-left parties. The center-right parties are any party that is a Christian Democratic conservative, or in some cases liberal. And center-left parties are social democratic parties, or in some cases liberal parties. Liberal parties with a right-left score in the comparative manifestos data as above 0 are coded as center-right, and those below 0 are coded as center-left. If anybody is interested in seeing which liberal parties are coded in what way, I have that. I have a slide on that if you want to see it. I have a table for that. Okay, so cool. That's the research design. What did we actually find? Well, first, what we have here is a model in which we don't include our main independent variable, the interaction term, right? It's not there. So we wanted a baseline model, and I should note that the controls were included in this, but I'm just not reporting them for the sake of space. What I want to draw your attention to first is this. This is the effect of a mainstream party shift towards greater Euroscepticism, just in general, regardless of how powerful, how strong the radical right party is. What you notice is it is negative, but it is statistically insignificant. There are no little stars there, right? So that suggests that a mainstream party shifting towards greater Euroscepticism independently doesn't really have any effect on that mainstream party's vote share. The vote share doesn't change between two parties, and between two elections rather. Okay. Model 2, however, we include this interaction between the shift towards Euroscepticism and radical right party electoral success. And what you notice is this negative coefficient, right? Negative 0.063, and it is statistically significant at conventional levels, 0.05. What this suggests is when a mainstream party shifts towards Euroscepticism in a country in which a radical right party is more successful, that mainstream party does in fact lose vote share. So this confirms hypothesis 1, at least statistically. The question is substantively. So what we have here on the y-axis is the marginal effect of a mainstream party shift, right, on mainstream party vote share. On the x-axis, we have radical right party success. These little black tick marks here are the distribution of radical right party electoral success. The solid black line is the expected marginal effect, and the dashed lines are 95% confidence intervals. So what you notice is this negative slope, right, this downward slope. So what this is saying is mainstream parties, when they shift towards greater Euroscepticism, lose vote share as radical right party success increases. Right? So there's one really important thing here, though. This doesn't look like much of a substantive effect, right? We don't see a clear effect, so that top 95% bound doesn't cross that 0 mark until about here, when a radical right party has received 18% of the vote. Right? This is a lot of the vote for a radical right party. In our data set, the average is something like 9%. So this is double radical right party. So we need to have a very successful radical right party. And as you notice from these black tick marks, there are only 7 instances in which this has happened in the data set. So this is a relatively rare occurrence. Mainstream parties will lose some vote share when shifting towards niche party positions when the niche party is more successful. In this case, Euroscepticism and radical right parties, right? This is not really all that interesting to me, right? It's like, oh, okay, really rare events. But if you remember, we did have a second hypothesis where we expected differentiated effects. And what we have here in Model 3 is the sample only including center-right parties. So when center-right mainstream parties shift towards greater Euroscepticism in the face of a more successful radical right party, this is the effect. We have a negative 0.143 coefficient, so negative again, and it is also statistically significant. What this suggests is, like previous model, when center-right mainstream parties shift towards Euroscepticism, in the face of a more successful radical right party, those center-right parties lose vote share. But again, how much is the question? What is the substantive effect? You notice, same figure, but that solid black line is at a much steeper angle here, right? It's much more, it has a much greater negative slope. So what this is telling us is that about here, when center-right mainstream parties shift towards greater Euroscepticism in the face of a more successful radical right party, they lose vote share. And that starts happening when radical right parties reach about 6% of the vote. This is about 3 percentage points lower than what the average is for the data set. And it's really not a high mark, right? In a place like Germany, 6% gets you into the parliament, but barely, right? And if we think about Germany, which I should point out is not in the data set, the radical right party, Alternative for Deutschland, received 13% of the vote in the last election. If we look at France, the Front National, the now Rassemblement National, received 20% of the vote in the 2017 presidential election. If we look at the Netherlands, for example, the Party for Freedom, I think it was somewhere around, also about 20% of the vote is what they received, if I remember properly. Either way, some of these parties are extremely successful, right? So at 6% here, we expect an actual loss for center-right mainstream parties. And what I think is really interesting is when we get to, say, here, about 10%, we're expecting a 1% drop in vote share for a mainstream political party. If we get to, say, 15%, which is not completely uncommon, we're now expecting 2%, right? And in cases like Austria here, where we have, and that's what this case is, 27% for the Freedom Party of Austria, we can expect like a 4% drop in vote share, which is obviously a very rare instance. But this is enough to actually swing the outcome of an election between center-right and center-left. Right? This is a sizable effect. Right? Now, what do we find for the center-left? So we find statistical significance as well. But if you notice, it's positive. Right? It's a 0.062 coefficient. That's the other direction. Right? So what that suggests is when center-left parties shift towards greater Euroscepticism in the face of a more successful radical right party, they actually may gain votes. Right? They do better. Right? But again, how much better is the question, right? So what we see here is the same thing, but for center-left parties only. And we do see that positive slope. Importantly, this 95% confidence interval, the lower bound, never crosses that zero. So we can't say with 95% confidence that there is a substantive effect here. And even if we use a 90% confidence interval, it just barely crosses that zero threshold. So I'm not comfortable saying center-left parties absolutely do gain in doing this, but what I would say is I'm very certain they don't lose, right? That maybe there's no effect at worst for center-left parties on this. So what have we found here? We find support for both of our hypotheses, sort of, right? Hypothesis one, we find, yes, mainstream parties suffer electoral losses when they shift towards a stronger radical right party on the issue of European integration. But hypothesis two kind of clears that up a little bit, it elucidates this a little. The relationship is driven entirely by these mainstream center-right parties, not by these center-left parties. And in fact, center-left parties don't appear to be affected much at all, and if they are, they might even actually gain from shifting towards greater Euroscepticism. Great. So what does all of this imply then? Does it suggest that there's no way to short-circuit these hard Eurosceptic radical right parties? Is there no way to stop them? They are established now, right? I would say that's not actually what should be taken away from this. There are, in my mind, two ways to address this issue.